ask any devout, law-hating Christian about the law of God, and you will hear statements like, well, Jesus fulfilled the law. Jesus abolished the law. We're not under the law. Grace plus nothing. The law was nailed to the commandments. We're not under. It's all about grace. Grace plus nothing. Just believe. Just accept. There's nothing you must do. Jesus fulfilled all of the law. Now, the ignorance that a lot of people have in this area is this, that during Jesus' walk on this earth, there existed two sets of law. One was the written law that Moses wrote down. Now you do understand that Moses didn't write his own law. Moses didn't go along just writing laws, he got it, he wrote it down, but it was given to him by God. So you have the written law that we have in the Bible written down. But then also when Jesus walked this earth, you had the oral law that existed. Now, what was this oral law? Well, the oral law of the Pharisees, the Jews of that day, was fence building around the law of God. In other words, each one of the 10 Commandments, they had built fences around each one of the 10 Commandments that explained every nuance of what you could and could not do. And just to give you an example, the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a very simplistic commandment. Take a break every seventh day. But the oral law, the Pharisees of Jesus' day said, okay, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? And so they came up with their oral tradition, or what's referred to as the tradition of the elders, the oral law. And the oral law said, okay, on the Sabbath, you can walk this far, but if you walk that far, it's a sin. Okay, this is a part of the oral law. All right, they said, okay, on the Sabbath, you can pick a few grapes off the vine, but if you pick a cluster, that's harvesting. That's a sin. And so they condemned Jesus' disciples for walking through a field of corn one day, and the disciples, I guess, sort of ran that through their fingers and popped a few kernels of corn in their mouth and began to eat on it. And the Pharisees looked and said, they're not doing that which is lawful to do. They're sinning by working. They're harvesting on the Sabbath. Where did they get that? It's not in the Bible. Is there nothing in the Bible that tells you how far you can walk or not walk, or clusters of grapes, or how much, there's nothing in there about it. It was the oral law. It was the tradition of the elders, the oral law. It was the fence building around the law of God that they were breaking, that the disciples were breaking. It was their interpretation of the law of God that they were breaking. And Jesus comes along and just totally dismisses the oral law. Of course, he got him killed because they had put the oral law on a par equal and above the 10 Commandments because they took such pride in their interpretation of the 10 Commandments. And this was the way they achieved their righteousness, by keeping this oral law perfectly, because it explained every nuance of what you could and could not do regarding the 10 Commandments. But it also made life miserable. I mean, these people were scared to stick their head out the door on the Sabbath day because, I guess making love was too much work or whatever. You can't do anything on the Sabbath day. So, and Jesus addressed the oral law again and again and again. Let's take a look at it. Matthew 15 and verse 2. It says, why do your disciples, these are the Pharisees asking the disciples this. Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread? That little statement, tradition of the elders, is a direct reference to the oral law. Just connect that up in your mind. The oral law, tradition of the elders. Why do you transgress, the tradition of the elders, oral law, by not, washing their hands before they eat and all that stuff? It was all this ritualistic work that they went through. And you may be unaware of how many times Jesus addressed the tradition of the elders, the oral law. Let's take a look at another look. Mark 7 and verse 9. And he said to them, full well you reject the commandments of God that you may keep your own traditions. All right, what traditions? It was their own tradition. It was the oral law, the tradition of the elders. It was the fence building around the law of God that made any, type of obedience to the law of God a miserable experience if you had to follow the code of the law, of the oral law, because no one could hardly do it. And again, this was the way they achieved. The reason they didn't need a Messiah, because in their pea-brain mind, if they kept this oral law perfectly, that was their righteousness. That's how they could get right with God. And what I'm saying is, Jesus came along. Yes, Jesus did come along, and he totally dismisses the oral law, the tradition of the elders, that is their interpretation of how to keep the law of God. He totally dismissed it and abolished it and did away with it. But the assumption that so many religious people make is, the assumption is that Jesus did away with all law. No, that doesn't even make any sense. Doesn't make sense. It was the oral law that Jesus dismissed.
Is that really in the Bible? What you think is in the Bible is not.